Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, Victor. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this presidential dialogue on the changing global financial architecture and the role of multilateral developing banks. I'm delighted that we have several heads of state and governments, governors, ministers, heads of global financial institutions that are joining us today, especially with this panel, to discuss this global issue. Just a few weeks ago, the United Nations Secretary General alerted the world that the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, are off track. If the SDGs are to succeed globally, they need to succeed first in Africa. We must tackle global food security, climate change, debt, health pandemic preparedness, given the experience we had, and a bad one, with COVID-19. In this regard, I would like to make 7 points. First, global financial architecture is failing Africa and developing countries as they face multiple global challenges. The global financial architecture needs to be modified to tackle more effectively global challenges and to accelerate achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Yet, with only 8 years to the target date for the SDGs, the world is off track in achieving them. Basically, therefore, we can and probably we must question the ability of the global financial architecture to serve the needs of the world, especially the needs and aspirations of developing countries, especially Africa. Before the pandemic hit, progress to achieve the SDGs was mixed and financing was falling way short. With $2.5 trillion of SDG financing gap for developing countries. Africa alone will need $1.3 trillion annually to achieve its Sustainable Development Goal needs by 2030. In addition, Africa requires $144 billion a year to recover from the tapering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic effects and to rebuild the economies back. Today, Africa faces 3 major challenges, and they are continuing. I call them the 3 C's: COVID, climate, and conflicts. The solution to these challenges, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, governors, is the same, which I call the 3 F's: finance, finance, and finance. Yet the available finance is very limited to tackle this myriad of challenges. That brings me to my second point. Global financial architecture needs to decisively tackle climate change. Climate change, as we heard in the first opening session, is devastating the economies of Africa. The continent, which accounts for only 3% in terms of historical carbon emissions, suffers disproportionately from the negative effects of climate change. The continent loses $7 to $15 billion annually due to climate change, and the trajectory is that that's probably going to get to $50 billion by 2030. Africa will need $2.7 trillion to implement the continent's nationally determined contributions by 2030. Yet, the global financial architecture provides only 3% of global climate finance for Africa. Africa received just about $18.3 billion annually in climate financing between 2016 and 2019. It's paltry. At current trends, the climate financing gap of $242 billion a year will remain through 2030. This will no doubt undermine Africa's efforts to support climate resilience and a just energy transition. We should make COP28, and I'm glad that the COP28 president-elect is here to be hosted by the United Arab Emirates, a defining moment for mobilizing greater private sector financing for climate change. That brings me to my third point. global financial architecture is ill-prepared to tackle the rising debt crisis, especially in developing countries and in Africa. The global financial architecture must respond effectively to tackle the rising debt challenges of African countries in the wake of the financial stresses posed by COVID-19, climate change, and recent conflict between Russia and Ukraine. While median public debt has declined to 65% of GDP from 68% in 2021 due to positive effects of debt relief efforts, including the debt service suspension initiative, debt levels are still higher than pre-pandemic levels of 61%. Excellencies, the structure of Africa's debt has also changed dramatically. While bilateral debt accounts for 27% of debt compared to 52% in 2000, commercial debt now accounts for 43% of total debt, compared to just 20% in 2000. Therefore, the expansion and fragmentation of creditor base complicates debt resolution by the Bretton Woods institutions and also by the Paris Club. There is therefore urgent need to reform the current international financial architecture to make it fit for orderly debt restructuring. Debt resolution in Africa, especially outside of the Paris Club processes, has often been disorderly and protracted with costly economic consequences. To avoid high debt resolution costs and to limit the likelihood of debt crisis re-emerging, the international community needs to push for enhanced transparency on debt and global coordination among creditors. It is critical to make the G20 Common Framework on Debt Treatment work and succeed. Now, of the 4 African countries, Chad, Ethiopia, Zambia, and Ghana, that have so far requested debt treatment under the Common Framework, while some progress has been made, none has yet to complete the process to benefit from the facility. So there's a lot of work that we still have to do collectively. In my view, there is need for an urgent need to reform the global financial and debt architecture to reduce the costs, the time, and the legal complications of debt restructuring for African countries. Brings me to my 4th point. Global contingency financing is not working well for Africa. Think of the following. The special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund has provided, of course, significant resources to help countries to deal with their ever-shrinking fiscal space. But of the $650 billion of SDRs issued, Africa got only $33 billion, and that's roughly about 4.5%. The African Union, as you heard, has called for the reallocation of about $100 billion of SDRs to Africa, with a portion of that going through the African Development Bank. As the chairman of the African Union, President Asali said, because the African Development Bank is a prescribed holder of SDRs. The African Development Bank has been spearheading the call for SDR rechallenging by developed countries to multilateral development banks. And why? The multilateral development banks can leverage. The key operative word is leverage, the SDRs. The bank can leverage it by a factor of 3 to 4 times. Now, by doing so, it will also allow us to provide greater financing to regional and national development banks all across Africa as part of the alliance we have, which is called Finance in Common, to accelerate achievement of the SDGs. And I saw my brother Remy Rio here, the President, CEO of Agence Française de Développement. I thank you very much for the leadership that you're providing on the Finance in Common. I am delighted that the innovative model of rechanneling SDRs to multilateral development banks, developed by the African Development Bank, working in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, has now been determined by the International Monetary Fund staff to meet the critical criteria, which is the reserve asset status quality for the SDRs, because without that, you can't really do a reallocation or rechanneling. Now, what this means is the SDR donor countries can now channel their SDRs to the African Development Bank and other multilateral development banks and still count them as reserves. This is indeed highly transformational and will be a game changer for Africa at no cost to taxpayers in SDR donor countries. Now, what we now need is to move forward. We need to have 5 lead donors countries to form a group to provide SDRs through the African Development Bank. And I want to thank the International Monetary Fund for its close partnership and support with us on this. Please, let's do that, because we have to work together a lot. It brings me to my 5th point. The current financial instruments are far from able to leverage the resources to tackle development challenges and calls for a change in the business models of multilateral financial institutions. And I always said people that I applaud Secretary Yellen for her bold call for this, that we need to change our business models because we are dealing with massive issues, and therefore we can't put new wine in old wineskin. The reality is that the global pension funds and institutional investors have over $145 trillion of assets under management. The global financial architecture should focus more on how to tap into these massive resources. This will require significant changes in their business models, including ourselves as multilateral financial institutions, to deploy more risk guarantee facilities, expand the use of synthetic securitization to leverage their balance sheets, and transfer some of their assets on their sovereign and non-sovereign books to the private sector to free up more space for additional lending. The African Development Bank has been leading globally in spearheading innovative approaches to stretch its balance sheet. Many of the recommendations of the G20 Capital Adequacy Report are already being implemented by the bank well before they were recommended. The African Development Bank, together with the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, implemented the first exposure exchange between multilateral development banks, which freed up $100 billion of additional lending room for us as a bank. Just tells you the power of what we can do when we work together. We are the first and the only multilateral development bank globally to implement a synthetic securitization program to transfer some of the portfolio on our non-sovereign books to the private sector. More importantly, the transaction brought new investors together that had never had an exposure to an African risk before to take their first credit exposure on the continent. And in 2022, with support of the United Kingdom, we concluded another groundbreaking risk transfer transaction of $2 billion for our sovereign portfolio to assist with scaling up climate finance. Once again, this is the first portfolio-based risk transfer by a multilateral development bank to be concluded on a sovereign portfolio that includes private sector investors. And in July of last year, our board of directors approved the issuance of sustainable hybrid capital, which the African Development Bank first conceived and started working on since 2021. This will be leveraged 3 to 4 times through the issuance of green, social, and sustainable bonds. It is important, therefore, to note that the African Development Bank remains the largest multilateral development bank issuer of social bonds to date. A planned sustainable hybrid capital issuance is on the horizon. In all these efforts, the African Development Bank, therefore, is moving beyond just project-based financing towards a portfolio-based approach and a system-wide approach for creating new asset classes for institutional investors to pool and diversify their risks. Welcome, Your Excellency, Mr. President. My 6th point. The multilateral financial architecture, for it to be more effective, there is need for greater leverage of private sector financing for development. And here, since I have our shareholders here, and many of you are the same across multilateral development banks, I want to say that asking multilateral development banks to do more should come with additional resources. There must be, of course, a strong review of capital adequacy of multilateral development banks. Expanding work to leverage private sector will consume risk capital. Yet available risk capital is extremely low. The reality is that multilateral development banks depend largely on callable capital, with only a small share of their capital being paid in capital. And we use that money very well. But this limits the effective risk capital that it can use, or they can use, to de-risk and leverage private sector financing at scale, due to strict prudential limits that each and other multilateral development banks must respect to keep their crucial AAA credit ratings. There should be a significant increase in capital of multilateral development banks, but more importantly, the share of their deployable risk capital, if the idea of moving from billions to trillions is to materialize. The African Investment Forum, which the African Development Bank and its partner launched in 2018, has become the premier private investment platform for Africa. It attracted over $142 billion of investment interest to Africa in just 4 years, covering 150 projects from Africa and global private sector investors, as well as institutional investors. I'm delighted to say the Africa Investment Forum for this year will be held 8 to 10 November in Marrakech in Morocco. The Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, AGIA, launched by the African Development Bank, Africa 50, and several partners, will also help to mobilize $10 billion of private sector financing for green infrastructure in Africa. It will contribute to G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment goal of mobilizing $600 billion for financing quality infrastructure. Seventh and my last point. Regional efforts should be promoted to tackle systemic risks in Africa, with regional safety nets to address myriads of exogenous shocks to complement the global safety net of the International Monetary Fund. Excellencies, Africa is the only region of the world that does not have liquidity buffers to protect it against shocks. To protect Africa from future economic shocks, the African Development Bank and the African Union, with actually support of African heads of state and government, are working together to establish an African financial stability mechanism. During the 35th ordinary session of the Assembly of the African Union, heads of state and government called for the establishment of the African Financial Stability Mechanism and directed the African Union Commission and the African Development Bank to work together with all relevant stakeholders to accelerate the operationalization of the mechanism and its growth. The African Financial Stability Mechanism will complement, I want to be clear, the global safety nets offered by the IMF to offer liquidity support for countries in times of crisis. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we need inclusive multilateralism with equity and fairness in representation in the Bretton Woods institutions. Achieving the reform of the global financial architecture requires that Africa's voice be strengthened, for example, on the board of the IMF, where the continent has just 2 seats. At the end of the day, the global financial architecture should be more responsive, inclusive, accountable, and re-engineered to support the accelerated development of the world, especially Africa. We must ensure that the priorities and challenges of Africa are on the front burner of the reforms of the global financial architecture. Africa's needs must never be forgotten. Thank you very much.